Good morning.
It's the afternoon now, apologies. I have the delightful honor of speaking about a topic and actually having a discussion with my panelists about a topic that I believe is one of the most important topics on our continent currently. Because it cannot be that I stand here as a Gen Z activist, one of the most underrepresented generations in leadership on the continent, yet it is the very same generation that is at the grassroots level, that is demanding change, that is at the forefront of not just demanding change, but creating impactful change. It is the same generation where about a week ago in Kenya, ensured that a bill that would endanger citizens in terms of taxes was prevented from being passed. It is the same generation where in many regions on the continent has actually created impactful change. And also, it is the same generation which, according to the demographics on the continent, happens to be the majority in our population as a continent. Yet it is the most underrepresented generation. It cannot be that in 2024, we celebrate Emma as Honorable Emma, as the youngest minister, and among the very few young people in leadership that are in their 20s on the continent. Yet she forms part of the majority of the population on the continent. So I'm so honored to form part of the discussion around intergenerational accountability, gatekeeping, and co-leadership, and allow me to welcome the panelists on stage. Dr. Mampele Rampele from South Africa, who is the Commissioner on the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. Beans Gawanas from Namibia, former Special Advisor on Africa for the United Nations, and Dr. Clarence Moniba from Liberia, who is from the Liberian National Union. Here is a mic. Thank you so much for joining me on stage. I'd like to get right into the discussion around particularly focusing on where we lost it with intergenerational leadership on the continent. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Rampele. You formed part of the anti-apartheid struggle for liberation in South Africa. And you formed part of the leadership of a particularly important movement, which was the South African Students' Organization, which led the Black Consciousness movement in the 70s. And you formed part of leading this with the late Steve Biko, which was a majority youth organization. And it's integral because in the anti-apartheid struggle for liberation, we saw a shift in the 70s where the struggle now was led by young people, and young people were at the forefront of demanding and fighting for liberation in South Africa. However, throughout the entire struggle and going into the transition into the democratic dispensation, we saw intergenerational leadership. We saw a combination of young people, but young people being supported by the advisory of the older generation. I'd like to reflect on exactly where we lost that, because today in our country, South Africa, just yesterday the cabinet was announced. And prior to yesterday's announcement, what we consistently see in every single administration is that as much as we have achieved the mark on equality in terms of the gender demographic within cabinet, however, we still see young people being underrepresented, and we don't see enough young people occupying office as ministers and forming part of the executive leadership. So where exactly do you think we lost it and we missed the mark?
Thank you very much. I'm just very proud to be part of an event that's led by young women who are very clear about the need for us to have a generational shift, a gender shift. And they're not taking us to a place unknown to this continent. They're just taking us home. Now, what happened to us in the 70s, in fact, it was the late 60s, that there was a wave across the globe. In America, it was anti-Vietnam and anti-racism. In Europe, it was anti-establishment. And there we were sitting in a country called South Africa, where less than 10% of the population had their boots on the necks of more than 90% of the population. So when we met as medical students at the University of Natal in 1968, we asked ourselves this question, weekend after weekend, because as a medical student, you're so busy, you don't have time during the week. Until one day we woke up to say, wait, as long as you call yourself non-white and you answer to someone saying you are a non-European, you have lost the plot. So framing the struggle as an anti-apartheid struggle, our elders were looking to get access to a system which was flawed. We were the first generation that said, no, we are not fighting against apartheid. We're fighting for full liberation. And that liberation starts with you. We had to name ourselves. And in that naming of ourselves as black and proud, boy, we became free spirits, unstoppable. I'm 76 now. Do you think I'm going to stop anytime soon? No. And also, we recognize that one of the real poisons of colonial conquest was imposing European values on us. Each time I meet my daughters, beautiful daughters and sons, and they tell me, I'm David, I'm Mavis. Hello. When you walk in London, have you ever seen a white Matumi? Or somebody you call Sipo in Germany? Why have we embraced? Naming is very sacred in African culture. When you are given a name, you are named after somebody to continue the lineage. And so I plead with you all. I know it's not your fault. I'm not saying hate your name. I'm just saying what we did, because we had those names. My middle name is Aleta because I'm named after my mother's mother, who was told to be baptized here to get this English name or this Dutch name. And so my point, though, is this, that we now have been in this journey of post-colonial era long enough, and yet we have not yet freed ourselves from the shackles of being named by others, how we think of ourselves. And as I said earlier on, we need to remember that we in Africa represent the first human civilization on earth. We are the cradle of humanity, and the cradle not only of a civilization, as they said, we're jumping from. We were the makers, the originators of science. Otherwise, how do you build pyramids? How do you do mummies if you don't understand the human body? And so my point is this, that my generation made the breakthrough. Where did we lose the plot? We lost the plot in 1990, when the elders came back from jail, from exile, and Mr. Mandela, and bless his soul, he said over and over, this liberation has not been won by the efforts of one organization. But the problem we have, whether it's in Namibia with SWAPO, or in South Africa with ANC, or in Zimbabwe with ZANU, is this wanting to own success. Success should have many fathers and mothers. And to the extent that we acknowledge that each one of us brought something to it. So we lost the plot there, and that's why we need to pick up. And that's why I'm here to say to you, I am part of those who lost the plot. So now, please forgive me and allow me to continue to support you, because I am committed. I'm Nala, I'm committed to this intergenerational collaboration and the shift to your generation to lead. Please lead.
Just before I come to you, Dr. Clarence, because you've done a very interesting thing in your career previously, I want to pick up on your point, Dr. Rampele, because you've identified where we missed the mark, and you are holding yourself accountable as well. However, I do want to say that you form part of a minority of the elder generation that is holding themselves accountable for actually excluding young people from leaving the grassroots level and forming part of leadership. How do we actually, as young people, get to the point where we pick up the plot? Because your generation was a generation that didn't ask to be in power, that didn't ask to go to the front, they took power. So what do we actually do? Because in our country particularly, we're seeing many young people from the administration, the 6th administration, which began in 2019, go into parliament. However, we're not seeing these members of parliament get into executive leadership and get into government. We're seeing them just remain in parliament. So the elder generation is continuously shutting the door. What do we actually do? Should we start a revolution and demand our place as well? What should we do?
You should start the revolution. Like we started the revolution, but what we did in that revolution, we recognized that as a small group of 15 people who couldn't actually have a revolution in the whole country. But we mobilized upwards and downwards. We went to high schools and mobilized, and those are the young people who led the June 16 uprising. We mobilized our elders in the faith community, workers, so that we knew we were just too small to do it. And so I don't want to hear people say, but our voices are not heard. My voice was not heard. In that group of 15, I was one of the 2 or so women. And I said, okay, we have now freed ourselves from being non-whites and non-Europeans. I'm a woman. And what a woman. I'm going to have us as a woman there, drawing on the strengths from the strong men from my family. And if you do it in a way that builds, if you're doing it to show off, then you're dead. But if you do it as a way that says to you, Ubuntu, as we say in Africa, has to be visible in how you deal with yourself, at the personal level, the professional level, and the political level. And once you do that, you will not be trapped in positions of power because you don't want to rock the boat. No. Please just step up and lead.
The instruction is clear to all the young people in the room. The instruction is clear. No one's going to hand our place to us. Dr. Clarence, you, in the duration of your career, got to a point where you took the courageous step to contest for president. And I am of the belief that young people on the continent are over-mentored but underfunded. And I'm sure outside of ageism, you must have faced challenges whilst campaigning. And a lot of young people face challenges whilst campaigning or trying to get into office due to a lack of funds. So what challenges did you face, and how do you think we can better address the financial challenges that young people face when they try to campaign for office? Because it's not any easy thing to do when you don't have the resource to do it.
And especially in Africa, where when you're running a campaign, instead of people giving money to you, you have to give money to them. So a typical example in Liberia, when you go speak to 500, 600 people, the first thing you have to do after you're leaving is to give them a thank you money. So yeah, right, exactly. So it's almost impossible if you're giving out $200, $300. And during my campaign period, I would give 8 speeches a day. So I'm giving 8 speeches a day. You're giving about $300, $400 to each group just because you have to do to appreciate them being there. Just imagine how much money that is. And the challenge we have as young people, obviously, is that we also don't believe in ourselves. A lot of times when I would go out and I would talk to young people to say, listen, I'm running for president. Really? You're young. Why? And I remember one of the most pressure day I had, I guess. I had a lot of elders come from my village and come from my county. It was 14 of them. I remember, because I remember sitting there counting all of them. It was 14 of them. And they came and say, oh, nephew, which is what they all call me. Nephew, you have a long life ahead of you. You should wait. Let the older folks go. And, I was very clear with them. I didn't want to brag, but I told them this. I said, listen, I'm the most educated person who had ever run for president. I have 2 masters and PhD. I've gone to some of the best schools in the world. I've worked for the UN. I've worked for African Development Bank. I've served as minister. I've headed the infrastructure development in this country. You should be ashamed, as my elders, as my fathers, as my uncle, to come and discourage me. And I was clear with them. Now, granted, they're not talking to me anymore because they said I disrespected them. But, the whole idea is that we as young people have to believe in ourselves. Once the young people, they see us building this momentum, this force, then the older generation will be forced to, to help support financially. But I always tell people, I said, nobody will ever, and it goes to what you were saying, nobody is ever going to hand us anything. If you want something, you take it. So I tell people I'm not going to live in the shadows. And so our generation, if we want to truly transform Africa, because we cannot say we are happy with how Africa is right now, especially when you come to Liberia and you see the underdevelopment. So a lot of times when people saw me, honestly, during my campaign period, I got more votes for the next election period than I got this one, because everybody would be like, oh, next time we're going to vote for you. And I said, fine, if you want me to wait, you also wait for a good education. You also wait for good roads, because our generation will be the one to transform Africa. Our generation will be the one to transform Liberia. And if we don't believe that, we will never be able to make the country and the continent that we want.
I just want to focus on the part where I touched on the financial aspect around the difficulty of running for office or campaigning for young people on the continent.
Right.
How can those challenges be better addressed to ensure successful campaigning for young people on the continent?
And the difficulty, so when you look at the continent in itself, right, you go to the Western world and you have billionaires. You have Trump, he's a billionaire. He's asking people for $1. He's asking people for $5. And I reference it. On a typical day, 15 to 20 people will ask me for money. But the idea is, if you do not give me money, how and why should I vote for you? So the issue is, it's very difficult because we're not a poor continent, but we act poor. And so it's going to be very difficult to go to somebody, you're giving a speech to 200 people, all of them are living on less than $2 a day, and you're going to generate money. It's going to be impossible. You're not going to be able to ask somebody who is barely eating, has no electricity, has no food, has no bed, and they're sleeping on a mat to give you money. So now we go back to why we continue to maintain this momentum of corrupt politicians maintaining themselves in government, in the elections, because they steal the money and go back and give the money to the people who are running. And so then people like us, we are stuck out of this whole ecosystem of finances because there's no support. And so it goes back to the idea, if the young people do not all band together and say, we are going to transform this country, the money is never going to come.
Absolutely. I believe in our campaigning as young people, if we can organize in large numbers, unite and bring ourselves together, and I'm going to use my country for example, if we had a young person run for office and they managed to organize young people, let's say 100,000 young people. If each of us gave that person 1 rand, that's 100,000 already. And if we gave them 1 rand on a monthly basis, do you see how much that is? So I think as young people, we also need to band together in supporting one another, because we're never going to be heard if we cannot unite. Mama Beans, I want to come to you because you've served on multilateral institutions, both continentally and internationally. And I want to know, what kind of support did you receive when you were starting your journey into leadership as an African woman? Because many times we see that African women, when they start their journey into leadership, they lack support. And not just in the beginning, but throughout their leadership journey. And what kind of support needs to come as well from global, larger feminist institutions in supporting African women through their leadership journeys?
May I start by saying that I am unapologetically a feminist. And because I am a feminist, I don't occupy positions without challenging the undercurrents. There is a huge difference between being just part of a women's movement and being part of a feminist movement. Feminists are radically asking questions about the status quo. The women's movement could sometimes be the gatekeepers. So I just want to start there. You know, solidarity, I know that it's a topic that will come up, afterwards. But when you enter into any position of power, just be 100% sure that if you do not have a support system around you, it's going to be difficult. And the support system does not necessarily come from other women. The support system also comes with the men with whom you are working. Because, I hope you understand that if the men that you are working with, because I used to tell the men, don't be Democrats by day and dictators by night. Because some men can respect us when we are in the public spaces. But they go home and they expect their wives to cook and to do all kinds of things for them. So that kind of mindset becomes problematic in the workplace if a man does not respect that you are his equal. Once you have that, like Doctor was saying, they were two among so many men. But yet their voices were there. And so for me, I have the loudest voice. I can speak without this mic. And I make sure that my voice is going to be heard wherever I am. The support system starts from your family. If your family believe in you, if they say, Beans, you can do it, you can make it, it really gives you that power and that to move forward. But if they don't have confidence in you, and if they say, oh my gosh, is she really going to make it? It's not going to work. Now, I will tell you, there are the kind of like formal support structures. But I have benefited a lot from the kind of informal support structures, where amongst us as women in leadership within the organization, we would meet over a meal. We would invite each other, we would dance and eat together. I may have had a very terrible day, but once I am in that kind of setting with other women, and I can share with them what I had experienced during the day, at work, it really makes a difference. So we should not always look for the kind of like formal support structures, but how do we create those informal settings where it's a safe space within which, you can work. But if I may just come back to this question of why do we not give to young people? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. No one gives power freely away. Once you have tasted power, and once you have tasted the trappings of power, you don't just give it away. And we never expected when we were young people that it will just happen that way. So you were laughing when doctor said revolution. Now people think revolution is always violent. No, revolution is that, don't tell us that we are the leaders of the future when we can lead now. Because if you wait for the future, that's evolution. It might never happen. So it's always right that you challenge us, that you tell us that, it's time to go. But Aya taught me something that I never thought of when we met for the first time. There were two things that she taught me. It was always about co-leading and co-creating. That are important terms for us as elders, because sometimes we feel threatened. You people always talk about this, these old people must go. And that is sometimes the kind of problematic that I see. Is there a space for all of us to share what we have together without anyone monopolizing anything? And I am entitled to work until the age of 60 or maybe 65. So don't tell me I'm old. Wait for your turn. But also, let us not limit leadership to political office. Political office, power in our countries can only be negotiated through political parties. Now, you could have a very democratic country, but if your political party is not democratic and give you that space, because otherwise you have to stand as an independent candidate, isn't it?
Yes.
You have to first get onto a party list. And that space on that party list, everybody wants to be there. Everybody, and it's not because you think you can serve the country better. Many people go on those lists because they want to eat better.
Absolutely, that's true.
And that is what we should fight against. Young people should be clear. If they want to be leaders, do they want to be unethical and corrupt leaders? Or do they want to become leaders so that they can serve their people? Because you can criticize the leaders now that they are not serving the people. But many of you come into positions, and that is where the problem comes. So intergenerational accountability cuts both ways. That I also want to hold you as young people. People come in, and you must use and abuse in the same way. That's why I'm saying it does not matter sometimes whether you are old or young. It's power that corrupts.
That's true. I'm going to ask my last two questions to Dr. Clarence and Dr. Rampele, and I'll open the floor for a Q&A because I see that we're left with 11 minutes. And Mama Beans is now talking about intergenerational accountability, which is very important, especially when we talk about intergenerational leadership. We need to ensure that young people are also held accountable, and in fact also ensure that young people are also not the ones doing the gatekeeping and are not the ones closing the door for other young people, and ensuring that when they get into any form of leadership, they're getting into that form of leadership just to fill their own pockets. So intergenerational accountability is important. So I want to ask you, Dr. Clarence, how do we dismantle the culture of young people who also get into leadership and close the door for other young people and are the actual gatekeepers?
And that's somewhat of the challenge. In Liberia, we always say, because In my country, like it is in a lot of different African countries, the richest people in the country are politicians. So as a 10-year-old child growing up, and they want to be rich, they don't say, I want to be a business person, because they see the business lady here, and she's selling fish, and she's barely eating. So they don't want to do that. They see the big car, they see the nice house. That's the minister's house. That's the senator's house. So they enter into government not to serve, but to gain. So inevitably, when you have a young person who ultimately gets into whatever branch of government, their mindset is not to serve. It's how can I make as much money as possible? Because this also plays to the fact of why the older generation, especially in Africa, will not give the younger people a chance. Because if you leave at 60, 65, there's no pensions. There's no ways to eat. So as a result, you're forced to cling on to that power you talked about. You're forced to hold on to power so that your family can eat, so that you can survive. And so all of these things comes back to the idea of we must demand. I always used to tell people, I say, don't vote for me because I'm young. Vote for me because I have a plan, I have the competency. That's what we should be looking for. Forget the youth. Let's look for competency.
On intergenerational co-leadership, Dr. Rampele, we have so much discourse locally, continentally, and internationally around young people and the power that young people have to bring about impact, create change. And so many people talk about young people and praise them for movements they've started to create change. However, whilst we see this discourse around young people, we still see that there's a culture of gatekeeping as well amongst the elder generation who sees the younger generation as only enough and fit for being in the streets, campaigning, protesting, demanding change. However, they don't see the young generation fit enough to take their advocacy from the street grassroots level and bring it into governance and decision-making spaces and leadership spaces. How do we
Because it's a colonial education system. We have a patriarchal system that says, you, as a woman, you think you can really lead. Or you are too young, you must wait. It's all in the way we are brought up, at home and in the school system. Now that's where I really believe legislation is one thing. We have a constitution equal to none. Incidentally, our democracy is not superior to any of the others in Africa. I think Botswana is doing better than us. We have imbibed the whole colonial model of education, of governance. And our education system, as I sit here, is worse than the education system I went through. And the thing is that education is meant to liberate the genius in every child, to make you feel that there is nothing that you can't do within your talent band. But every time you get to school, you are told you're not smart enough, you are not this, you are not that, you are too poor, you're that. So I'm pleading with you, Sisi, Aya, please, let's put education front and center. We need education for liberation. That education will help us from preschool, where kids must grow up believing that there is nothing impossible. Then all these questions will, in the end, as well as, they have to be, education transformation must be accompanied by a socio-economic transformation. The economic system we have is winner take all. So if you have a capitalist system like we have, you cannot but have a governance system that is all for winners. So please, let us have the revolution in education, in socio-economic development, and this old lady will be behind you cheering.
Eurocentric and Afrocentric. You know, when the UN was established in 1948, where were we? Huh? Where were the Africans? Were they at that table when the UN was established? No. But we joined the UN. We joined as African states. And what is happening today at the UN in terms of, if you were watching what was going on in terms of the resolutions of the Security Council, that is when the reality really kicks in, that multilateralism might not necessarily suit peace and security at the moment, because it's very selective. Double standards have been shown to exist. African states have, since I was at the African Union, had asked for the reform of the Security Council. Now, remember this. When you have the power, you don't give power up easily. And so we might wait forever for the Security Council to reform, because at the end of the day, they have to decide how to reform themselves. You understand? It's not there's no superior other authority that can say you must reform this way. So that's one thing I want to say. Multilateralism is the best option for world peace and for development. Unfortunately, it never speaks to the issues that we are faced with as Africans. Secondly, I fully agree with what Doctor is saying. Had we had an opportunity to say at independence, we are going to stop, we are going to completely restructure, and then we will continue. Unfortunately, that does not always happen. Many times we gain our independence through negotiated settlements. And once you go into a negotiated settlement, you have to make compromises. You have to do all kinds of things. But that still does not mean that peace on our continent, for example, why don't we use the mechanisms that we had always had in terms of conflict resolution? And that's maybe why there's always going to be this, recurrence of conflicts, because we are not dealing actually with the root causes for which the conflict has arisen in the first place. And we think it's merely a power sharing deal. Conflicts happen because people are hungry. Conflicts happen because people have no access to resources. Conflicts happen because of bad governance and corruption. But when we negotiate peace, we never take those things into account. So I do believe that, the spirit of Ubuntu is what has driven some of us all our lives, that I never thought that I have achieved. I always thought I have achieved because of others. And so whatever we do with compassion. We do with empathy of the other. If you don't have empathy and you are only interested in the position that you occupy, can I leave you with a last word? Do not occupy a position. Use the position as a tool for social transformation. That is what is important.
Thank you so much to my panelists. In closing, nothing about the continent can be discussed when there are other people missing at the table, when young people are not at the table. Nothing for young people without young people being there, and we must ensure that we're all equally represented at the table. There must be nothing for the continent without all of us there. Thank you very much.